300 of Manhattan's elite gasped in unison as the priest's microphone let out a deafening, high-pitched screech. We were exactly 60 seconds away from saying, "I do." The string quartet had just faded into a reverent silence. The priest had just opened his mouth to deliver the final binding vows. And that's exactly when my future mother-in-law, Eleanor, stepped right past the bridesmaids, marched up the marble stairs of the altar, and shoved a violently thick 20-page legal document directly into my chest. She didn't even bother lowering her voice. In fact, she grabbed the microphone from the priest's trembling hands, making absolutely sure her next words echoed through the vaulted ceilings of St. Patrick's Cathedral. "Sign it," Eleanor demanded, her manicured finger tapping the signature line, her designer heels clicking sharply against the stone. "Sign away any and all claims to the Upper East Side condos, the Hamptons estate, and the family trust, or this wedding is over right now. We all know why you're really here, Chloe. I will not stand by and let a penniless little gold digger steal what my family has spent 4 generations building." The silence in the cathedral was suffocating. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. 300 pairs of eyes burned into my back. The flashing of a rogue paparazzi camera near the back doors illuminated the absolute horror on my bridesmaids' faces. I slowly turned to Michael, the man I was supposed to spend the rest of my life with. The man whose struggling tech business I had secretly been holding together from the shadows. I looked into his eyes, waiting for him to rip the microphone from his mother's hand, to defend me, to throw her out of our wedding. Instead, he just stared at the marble floor, his face flushed red. He wouldn't even make eye contact with me. "Just sign it, Chloe," he muttered under his breath, leaning in so the mic wouldn't catch it. "It's just a formality to keep Mom happy. If you really love me, you won't care about the money. Just do it so we can get married." He thought I was going to cry. Eleanor thought I was going to crumble, sign her insulting ambush of a contract in a puddle of my own tears, and spend the rest of my life as her submissive, financially trapped little peasant. They both calculated that the sheer embarrassment of a public cancellation would force me into submission. They miscalculated, spectacularly. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, a slow, freezing smile spread across my face. I started laughing, a cold, echoing laugh that made the murmurs in the pews stop instantly. I looked down at the prenup, then looked up at Eleanor's smug, Botox-frozen face, and I snatched the microphone right out of her hand. "You're right, Eleanor," I said, my voice ringing out crystal clear over the massive surround sound speakers. "This wedding is officially over, but before everyone heads to the reception, there are a few things this room should know about the groom and his delightful mother." I turned to Michael. He suddenly looked like he was going to be physically sick. "Michael," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm whisper that still echoed through the church. "Remember that anonymous angel investor? The one who bailed out your failing tech firm 6 months ago? The one who handed you a $500,000 lifeline when every bank in New York laughed you out of their lobby? You know that holding company Apex Capital? Check the LLC registry when you get a chance. I am Apex Capital." A collective, audible gasp rippled through the front pews. Michael's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and sheer terror. "And per the emergency loan agreement you signed," I continued, "which clearly states the debt can be recalled immediately in the event of character breach, fraud, or emotional distress. I am recalling the loan. I want my $500,000 back in my account by Monday morning. If the wire isn't there by 9 a.m., my lawyers will legally seize your entire company, dismantle it, and sell it for parts." Michael's knees physically buckled. He grabbed the edge of the altar to stop himself from collapsing, his face draining of all color, gasping for air like a fish out of water. But I wasn't done. I turned back to Eleanor. Her smug, aristocratic sneer had completely vanished, replaced by a twitching pale mask of absolute horror. "And as for you, Eleanor," I said, taking a step closer to her, You went through all this incredible trouble today to protect your precious over-leveraged real estate portfolio from a penniless nobody. It's hilarious, really. Because if you had bothered to do a simple background check on me instead of just judging my thrift store coats, you would have found out about the Silicon Valley tech startup I co-founded when I was 22. The one that went public last year. I let the silence hang for a second, making sure every single one of her high society friends was listening closely. You just forced your son to blow his only chance at a legal claim to my $7.5 million stock portfolio. And you did it all to protect a couple of heavily mortgaged condos. I took her 20-page prenuptial agreement and calmly dropped it into the decorative baptismal font at the base of the altar, watching the ink immediately start to bleed into the holy water. I looked at the priest, smiled politely, and handed him the mic. "Sorry for the inconvenience, Father," I said. Then I turned to the crowd. "The reception next door at the plaza is already paid for. Everyone is welcome to go enjoy the open bar, the caviar, and the filet mignon. Except for Michael and Eleanor. My private security team will be escorting them off the premises immediately. Right now, you're probably staring at your screen, wondering how the hell I pulled this off. How a supposedly broke, orphaned girl managed to infiltrate one of New York's snobbiest, most toxic high society families, hide a multi-million-dollar fortune right under their surgically altered noses, and perfectly orchestrate the most humiliating public execution of an entitled mother-in-law in wedding history. You're probably wondering how Michael could be so incredibly blind, and what could have possibly pushed me to exact such ruthless, surgical revenge in front of 300 people. The truth is, Eleanor didn't just insult me. She crossed a line so dark, so deeply unforgivable 3 months before the wedding, that simply breaking up with Michael wouldn't have been enough. I didn't just want to leave them. I wanted to financially and socially obliterate them. I wanted them to feel the exact same terror, betrayal, and helplessness they tried to force onto me in secret, and to understand the brilliant, twisted trap I set for Eleanor and the absolutely disgusting family secret I discovered that made me do it. We have to rewind. Back to the very first dinner I ever had at their Hamptons estate. The night Eleanor looked me dead in the eye, handed me a glass of cheap wine, and made the biggest, most expensive mistake of her miserable life. The first time I stepped onto the crushed limestone driveway of the Vanderwall family's Hamptons estate, I knew I was walking into a war zone. I just didn't realize the extent of the casualties they had planned for me. It was a brisk evening in late October, exactly 2 years before the cathedral disaster. Michael had been hyping up this introduction for weeks. He painted his mother, Eleanor, as a demanding but fiercely loving matriarch who just wanted the best for her only son. I had worn a simple, off-the-rack navy dress. I drove up in my 10-year-old slightly dented Honda Civic, parking it next to a fleet of pristine Range Rovers and a vintage Mercedes. When Eleanor opened the massive mahogany front doors, she didn't greet me. She didn't even say hello. Her eyes immediately darted past my shoulder, locking onto my beat-up car in her immaculate driveway. Her face contorted into a tight, aristocratic grimace, as if someone had just left a bag of burning garbage on her front porch. "Michael, darling," she cooed, kissing his cheek while entirely ignoring my existence. "You didn't tell me your guest was driving a lawnmower. The valets won't know what to do with it." Michael gave a nervous, breathy laugh and squeezed my hand. "Mom, be nice. This is Chloe." Eleanor finally looked at me. Her gaze was like a physical scan, dissecting my cheap shoes, my unbranded purse, and the distinct lack of a generational trust fund radiating from my posture. "Chloe," she said, tasting the name like sour milk. "How quaint. Come in. Try not to track gravel onto the Persian rugs. They're older than your home state." That night at dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Eleanor seated me at the far end of the sprawling 20-foot dining table, strategically placing massive floral arrangements between Michael and me so we couldn't even make eye contact. And then came the wine incident. When the private chef came around pouring a vintage 1990 Chateau Margaux for Eleanor, her husband, and Michael, Eleanor subtly held up her hand as he approached my glass. "Oh, don't waste the Margot on the girl, Thomas," she said loudly, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Her palate wouldn't understand it. Bring out that leftover boxed wine from the staff kitchen. Pour it into a nice crystal goblet so she feels included." I sat there, perfectly still, as the chef awkwardly poured cheap, vinegary red wine into my glass. I looked down the table at Michael, my charming, supposedly fiercely protective boyfriend suddenly found his asparagus incredibly fascinating. He didn't say a word. He didn't defend me. He just let it happen. I took a sip of the terrible wine, smiled politely at Eleanor, and said, "Delicious. Thank you." She smirked, thinking she had successfully established the food chain. She thought she had put the broke, desperate little orphan girl perfectly in her place. What Eleanor didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that exactly 4 hours before that dinner, I had sat in a glass-walled boardroom in Manhattan and quietly signed the final paperwork for the IPO of the cybersecurity software company I had co-founded in my college dorm room. I grew up bouncing between foster homes in Ohio. I knew what it was like to be hungry, to be invisible, to be treated like a burden. When I learned to code on a donated dial-up computer at the local library, I promised myself I would never be helpless again. By 22, I had built an algorithm that revolutionized cloud data encryption. By 25, I was sitting on a completely liquid, untraceable fortune of $7.5 million. But wealth comes with a very specific, very terrifying paranoia. When people find out you have money, their eyes change, their smiles change. You stop being a person and you start becoming an opportunity. I had been burned before by friends and exes who only loved my bank account. So I made a strict rule. I kept my Honda Civic. I bought my clothes at thrift stores. I lived in a tiny rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn. I wanted someone to fall in love with me. The scrappy, deeply flawed, aggressively normal Chloe. Not the girl with a black card and an offshore holding company. When I met Michael at a local coffee shop, he thought I was a struggling freelance graphic designer trying to make rent. And he pursued me anyway. He brought me pastries. He listened to my stories. He seemed like a grounded guy who was desperately trying to build his own tech startup from the ground up, refusing to rely on his family's legendary real estate wealth. I fell madly in love with the illusion of the man he presented to me. Over the next year, Eleanor's campaign of terror escalated from passive-aggressive dinner parties to blatant cruelty. She would accidentally spill red wine on my only winter coat. She would mail me clippings of minimum-wage job openings. When Michael proposed to me with a modest, beautiful ring he swore he saved up for, Eleanor threw a fit so massive she faked a panic attack and had to be hospitalized just to ruin our engagement night. Through it all, Michael played the exhausted peacemaker. "She's just old-fashioned, Chloe," he would beg, holding me as I cried out of sheer frustration. "We just have to play her game until the wedding. Once we're married, we'll distance ourselves. I promise." I endured it because I loved him, and because I thought he was suffering too. 6 months before the wedding, Michael's tech startup hit a brick wall. His main investor pulled out, his servers crashed, and he was staring down bankruptcy. I came to his apartment one night to find him sobbing on the bathroom floor, clutching a bottle of whiskey, talking about how he was a failure. How he would have to go crawling back to his mother and beg for a job in her real estate firm, becoming her puppet forever. It broke my heart. I couldn't stand seeing the man I loved stripped of his pride. So, I did what any secret millionaire violently in love would do. I made a phone call. I contacted my wealth management team and had them set up a dummy holding company called Apex Capital. Within 48 hours, an anonymous angel investor reached out to Michael's firm, offering a $500,000 emergency bailout loan. The terms were incredibly generous, with one strict caveat. The loan was tied directly to his personal character and operational integrity. Standard boilerplate stuff, or so he thought. The day the funds hit his business account, Michael took me out to a lavish dinner. He was glowing. He told me the universe was finally rewarding his hard work. I smiled, toasted to his success, and went to sleep that night feeling like I had saved my future husband's soul. I thought we were a team. I thought we were fighting against his toxic family together. But 3 months before the wedding, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the illusion violently shattered. Michael had told me he was going upstate for a 3-day solo meditation retreat to clear his head before the wedding. I had spent the morning in the city finalizing the catering, and I realized I had left my laptop in the trunk of his car. Knowing the Hamptons estate was closer to the city than his retreat, I checked his location on our shared GPS app. He wasn't upstate. He was at his mother's house. Figuring he just changed his plans and wanted to avoid an argument, I drove out to the estate. I didn't knock. I still had the spare key he had given me for emergencies. The house was dead silent, save for the sound of rain lashing against the massive bay windows. As I walked down the main hallway toward the kitchen, I heard voices coming from Eleanor's private study. The heavy oak door was cracked open just an inch. I stepped closer, intending to push the door open and surprise him, but my hand froze mid-air when I heard my name. "Are you absolutely sure she's going to sign the liability waivers, Michael?" Eleanor's voice was sharp, devoid of any of her usual theatrical flair. It was pure, calculating ice. "The IRS auditors are breathing down our necks. We cannot afford a single mistake." I stopped breathing. I pressed my back against the cold hallway wall, straining to listen. "She's practically a golden retriever, Mom," Michael replied. The voice didn't sound like my loving, stressed-out fiancé. It sounded bored, annoyed. "She's so desperate for a family. She'll sign anything if she thinks it proves she loves me. I've been feeding her the us-against-the-world garbage for a year and a half. She eats it up." "You're sure she has no assets?" Eleanor pressed. "No hidden family debts? Her credit is completely spotless?" "Spotless and entirely empty," Michael scoffed. "She's a ghost. That's why she's perfect. The lawyers already drafted the offshore transfer papers. The second we say I do, her social security number gets legally bound to the 3 shell companies we used to hide the failing real estate debt. She technically becomes the primary shareholder of the toxic assets." I felt the blood physically drain from my face. My stomach violently heaved. "Good," Eleanor said, "because the feds are going to raid your little tech company within the year. The embezzlement is too obvious now. When the dominoes fall, the criminal charges for the wire fraud and the tax evasion will bypass us entirely and land squarely on the primary shareholder." "I know, Mom." Michael sighed, a terrifyingly casual sound. "Chloe takes the fall. She goes to federal prison. The debt gets legally dissolved through her conviction, and I file for an annulment based on criminal fraud. It's clean." "I just can't stand looking at the poor little rat," Eleanor muttered, pouring a drink. "The thrift store clothes, that pathetic, eager-to-please smile. It makes my skin crawl. Tell me you aren't actually sleeping with her anymore." "God, no," Michael laughed. A cold, cruel laugh that echoed in the empty hallway. "I just close my eyes and think about the payout. 3 more months, Mom. Then the trap snaps shut, and we're free." I didn't gasp. I didn't scream. I didn't burst into the room weeping and demanding answers. As I stood in that dark hallway, listening to the man I loved perfectly articulate his plan to use me as a disposable human shield for a multi-million-dollar federal crime, something inside of me fundamentally broke. But it wasn't my heart. You see, up until that exact second, the narrative of this story was simple. A poor, insecure girl being bullied by a wealthy, powerful family. But as I stood there listening to their financial death rattle, the perspective violently shifted. The Vanderwaal family wasn't wealthy. They were massively criminally bankrupt. They were drowning in illegal debt, terrified of prison, and grasping at straws. They thought they had lured a clueless, broke sheep into the slaughterhouse to take the bullet for them. They had absolutely no idea that the sheep possessed the liquid capital to buy their entire bloodline 3 times over. They didn't know I was the anonymous lender who literally owned the deed to Michael's failing company. I silently backed away from the door. I walked out of the house, stepped into the pouring rain, and got back into my 10-year-old Honda Civic. I didn't shed a single tear. Instead, as I turned the key in the ignition, a slow, dark smile spread across my face. They wanted to play a game of corporate espionage and financial ruin? Fine, but I wasn't just going to break up with him. I was going to let them spend millions on a wedding they couldn't afford. I was going to let them march right up to the altar believing their trap had worked. And then I was going to rip their lives apart piece by piece in front of every single person they knew. The next 90 days were the greatest acting performance of my life. Every morning, I woke up, made Michael his favorite pour-over coffee, and kissed the cheek of a man who was actively plotting my federal prison sentence. It made my skin crawl. Every time he called me his sweet, naive angel, I had to bite the inside of my cheek until it bled just to keep from laughing in his face. He thought he was playing me. He had no idea I was already holding the match, just waiting to burn his entire world to the ground. I needed bulletproof evidence, not just audio from a hallway. I needed the exact offshore transfer papers Eleanor mentioned. I needed the routing numbers, the shell company names, and the forged signatures they planned to use to ruin my life. Lucky for me, Michael was a complete idiot. He was running a tech company, but his personal operational security was a joke. His laptop password was Eleanor1, a terrifying Freudian nightmare I didn't have time to unpack. 3 days after I overheard their little murder-by-proxy plot, Michael went to the gym. He left his MacBook open on the kitchen island. I didn't need to guess his password. I'm a cybersecurity architect. I plugged a custom USB drive into his port. He ran a script I wrote in college and bypassed his firewall in less than 40 seconds. I mirrored his entire hard drive. Every email, every hidden folder, every deleted text message. I had it all in my pocket before he even finished his first set of bench presses. That night, sitting in the dark of my tiny Brooklyn apartment, I cracked open his encrypted files. What I found was so much worse than a simple tax dodge. Michael and Eleanor weren't just hiding real estate debt. They were actively embezzling money from the Vanderwall Family Foundation, a charity meant to fund pediatric cancer research. They were draining the charity accounts, funneling the cash into an offshore LLC in the Cayman Islands, and using it to prop up Eleanor's failing Hamptons properties. And right there, in a folder labeled Wedding Prep, I found the smoking gun. It was a perfectly forged stack of incorporation documents. They had already registered a dummy corporation in my name. They had forged my signature on over a dozen federal tax documents. The plan was meticulously documented. The day after we signed the marriage license, they were going to legally bind my new married name to the fraudulent accounts, effectively framing me as the mastermind behind a $12 million embezzlement ring. They weren't just throwing me under the bus. They were driving the bus, backing it up, and running me over twice. I didn't just get mad. I got to work. I called Vance, an ex-federal prosecutor who now handled private wealth protection for my tech firm. When I slid the flash drive across his mahogany desk and told him what was on it, Vance didn't blink. He just smiled, the kind of terrifying, predatory smile you pay a lawyer $1,000 an hour for. "So, we take this to the FBI?" Vance asked, tapping the drive. "Eventually," I said, leaning back in my leather chair. "But first, I want to bleed them dry." Vance loved the idea. We spent the next 2 months secretly restructuring the Apex Capital loan I had given Michael. I used a loophole in his original contract to attach a hidden lien to Eleanor's only remaining unmortgaged asset, a multi-million-dollar art collection sitting in her Manhattan penthouse. If Michael defaulted or committed fraud, Apex Capital legally owned her Picassos. With the legal trap perfectly set, I turned my attention to the wedding. If they were going to use this wedding as a smokescreen to frame me, I was going to make sure the smokescreen bankrupted them. Suddenly, the frugal, low-maintenance bride disappeared. I started agreeing with every insanely expensive idea Eleanor had. When she suggested upgrading from the standard floral arrangements to imported white orchids from Holland, I gasped and said, "Oh, Michael, we have to. It's what your mother wants." When she insisted we rent out the entire Plaza Hotel ballroom instead of just the dining hall, I played the starry-eyed peasant. "I just want to fit into your world, Eleanor," I whispered, practically batting my eyelashes. They fell for it completely. They thought I was finally submitting to their lifestyle. They didn't realize they were financing their own funeral. Because they were completely out of liquid cash, Eleanor had to take out a high-interest, predatory title loan against the Hamptons estate just to cover the $250,000 catering bill. Every time she handed over a black Amex to a vendor, I knew she was sweating. I knew the interest rates were choking her, but her toxic high society pride wouldn't let her back down. She had to keep up appearances for her country club friends. She was literally borrowing money from loan sharks to buy beluga caviar for a wedding that was never going to happen. Which brings us right back to the altar. Right back to St. Patrick's Cathedral, with the ink of Eleanor's 20-page prenup bleeding into the holy water, and 300 guests suffocating in a deafening, horrified silence. Michael was still clinging to the marble altar, hyperventilating. He looked like he had just been hit by a freight train. "Chloe," he choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. He reached out, trying to grab my wrist. "Chloe, please, you don't mean this. We can talk about this. The loan, the company. You can't just take it." I casually stepped back, out of his reach. The cathedral acoustics picked up the sharp click of my heels. "I already did, Michael," I said, my voice echoing over the speakers. "Vance filed the default paperwork at 8 a.m. this morning. You breached the morality clause the second you forged my signature on those Cayman Island incorporation papers." The gasp from the front row of bridesmaids was so loud it could have shattered stained glass. Michael recoiled as if I had shot him in the chest. His eyes darted around frantically, realizing that I didn't just know about the money. I knew about the crimes. "You're lying!" Eleanor suddenly shrieked. Her pristine, aristocratic facade had completely disintegrated. She lunged forward, her claw-like acrylic nails aiming right for my face. She didn't make it 2 steps. Before I even had to flinch, a massive hand clamped down on Eleanor's shoulder, stopping her dead in her tracks. It was one of the groomsmen. The tall, broad-shouldered man in the custom tuxedo hadn't said a word all morning. Michael thought he was my distant cousin from Ohio. Eleanor thought he was just a seat filler I hired because I had no friends. He was neither. His name was Marcus, and he was the head of my private security detail. Marcus easily spun Eleanor around and pinned her arms behind her back with terrifying grace. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back," Marcus rumbled, his voice low but carrying a lethal weight. "Get your hands off me, you peasant!" Eleanor screamed, kicking her designer heels against the marble stairs. "I am Eleanor Vanderwall. I own half of this city. I will have you arrested." "Actually, Eleanor," I interrupted, stepping down one marble stair so I was looking directly into her wild, mascara-smeared eyes. "You don't own anything. The bank owns the Hamptons house. Apex Capital officially owns your art collection. And as of an hour ago, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division owns your Cayman Island bank accounts." Eleanor froze, the fight completely drained out of her body, leaving her hanging limply in Marcus's grip. "That's right," I whispered, leaning in close so only she and Michael could hear the final nail going into the coffin. "I didn't just hack Michael's laptop. I forwarded every encrypted ledger, every forged tax return, and every pediatric charity withdrawal to a very eager federal agent. They froze your offshore accounts at noon." I pulled a small folded piece of paper from my bridal bouquet. I smoothed it out and pressed it flat against Michael's trembling chest. "This isn't a wedding vow, Michael," I said softly. "It's a subpoena." Michael looked down at the federal document. His legs finally gave out. He collapsed onto the cold marble floor, his expensive tuxedo pooling around him. He buried his face in his hands and started sobbing. Not polite, quiet tears, full, heaving, ugly cries. The illusion of the brilliant tech CEO was gone. He was just a terrified little boy who got caught stealing. I looked up at the sea of shocked faces in the pews. New York's elite were sitting there with their mouths hanging open. Some were recording on their phones. Others were aggressively whispering to their spouses, already preparing to excommunicate the Vanderwalls from their social circles before the reception even started. "As I said earlier," I announced into the microphone, my voice bright and cheerful, "the reception is fully paid for. Please, go enjoy the open bar. The Vanderwalls spared absolutely no expense. I handed the microphone back to the bewildered priest, who was clutching his Bible like it was a life preserver. I didn't run down the aisle in tears. I didn't rush. I took my time. I walked back down the long red carpet of St. Patrick's Cathedral with my head held high, my massive diamond ring sparkling under the vaulted lights. The crowd literally parted for me, pulling their knees in as if touching my dress would electrocute them. As I reached the massive oak doors at the back of the church, the paparazzi who had been snapping photos earlier stepped forward. They weren't holding cameras anymore. They were holding badges. "Eleanor and Michael Vanderwall," one of the men in a cheap gray suit shouted over the murmuring crowd. "We're with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, tax evasion, and grand larceny." I pushed open the heavy cathedral doors and stepped out into the crisp New York afternoon. The sun was shining. The traffic on Fifth Avenue was buzzing. I looked to my left. Waiting by the curb was a sleek black Maybach, engine purring. Vance was sitting in the back seat, holding 2 glasses of incredibly expensive vintage Chateau Margaux. "How did the vows go?" Vance asked with a smirk as I slid into the leather seat. "Perfectly," I said, taking the crystal goblet. "I promised to love, honor, and financially ruin them. I take my commitments very seriously." As the Maybach pulled away from the curb, heading toward the Plaza Hotel where I fully intended to party with my own friends on Eleanor's dime, I looked out the tinted window. I watched as Marcus and the federal agents dragged Michael and Eleanor down the cathedral steps in handcuffs. Eleanor's perfect updo had collapsed, her hair hanging in her face as she shrieked at the photographers now swarming the sidewalk. Michael was just staring blankly at the pavement, his life completely over. They thought I was a poor, invisible ghost they could use and throw away. They were half right. I was a ghost. But I wasn't the kind you could ignore. I was the kind that haunted you until you had absolutely nothing left. The reception at the Plaza Hotel was, without a doubt, the greatest party of the decade. If there is one thing you need to understand about Manhattan's ultra-wealthy elite, it's that they have absolutely zero loyalty. They respect power, they respect money, and above all, they respect a winner. When I walked into that grand ballroom wearing a custom Vera Wang gown that I had secretly bought myself, the room didn't fall silent. Instead, they erupted into applause. People who had spent the last 2 years looking down their surgically refined noses at me were suddenly practically sprinting across the marble floor to hand me a glass of champagne. They gossiped viciously about Eleanor, trading stories about how they always knew she was living on borrowed time, how her country club membership was always late, how her Hamptons house smelled like cheap perfume and desperation. I played the perfect host. I toasted to new beginnings, ate beluga caviar, and danced with my security team while Michael and Eleanor were busy trading their designer clothes for standard-issue orange jumpsuits in a federal holding cell downtown. But the real work started on Monday morning. At exactly 8:59 a.m., I sat in Vance's corner office watching the digital clock on his desk tick upward. When it hit 9 a.m., Vance smiled, picked up his phone, and made the call. Michael's tech company didn't just get seized, it got surgically dismantled. So my legal team walked into his corporate lobby with a stack of court orders thick enough to stop a bullet. They froze every server, locked every bank account, and escorted his bloated, overpaid executive board right out the front doors. But I didn't fire the ground-level engineers. I knew what it was like to be a struggling coder working for a narcissistic boss. I reviewed their salaries, gave every single developer a 20% raise, and absorbed the viable tech into my own cybersecurity firm. Michael had spent 3 years trying to build an empire, and I stripped it from him in less than 45 minutes. Later that afternoon, the financial guillotine dropped on Eleanor. Because Apex Capital held the primary lien on her unmortgaged assets, the seizure of her Manhattan penthouse was swift and utterly ruthless. I actually went to the apartment with the appraisal team. Walking through those opulent, echoing halls, I watched as men in white gloves carefully took down her prized Picasso, her antique Persian rugs, and her imported crystal chandeliers. Everything she had used to make me feel small, Everything she had valued more than human decency was meticulously cataloged, boxed up, and shipped to a high-end auction house in Geneva. But the most satisfying moment of the entire aftermath didn't come from the money. It came from the federal indictments. You see, when you corner a rat, it doesn't just bite its enemies, it bites whatever is closest to it. And the Vanderwalls were the biggest rats in New York. During the federal investigation, the prosecution offered a slight leniency deal to whoever flipped first. The ink on the offer wasn't even dry before Michael and Eleanor absolutely violently threw each other under the bus. Vance managed to get his hands on the interrogation transcripts, and reading them was better than any novel I've ever picked up. Michael sat in a windowless room, crying hysterically, telling the FBI agents that his mother was a manipulative mastermind who forced him into the embezzlement scheme under the threat of disowning him. He claimed he was just a helpless victim of her psychological abuse. In the very next room, Eleanor was practically foaming at the mouth. She told the feds that Michael was a degenerate gambler and a failed businessman who had secretly drained her accounts, claiming she was just a trusting, senile mother who signed whatever her son put in front of her. They turned on each other with a viciousness that proved they never really loved anyone but themselves. But the FBI didn't care about their finger-pointing. The mirrored hard drive I had provided was the holy grail of financial prosecuting. It had timestamps, IP addresses, and digital signatures proving they were both equally complicit in every single forged document and stolen dollar. 6 months after the wedding that never happened, I sat in the back row of a federal courtroom wearing a perfectly tailored, ridiculously expensive Chanel suit. I watched as the judge banged his gavel, his voice echoing with a glorious, heavy finality. He didn't hold back. He called their actions a repulsive display of aristocratic greed and profound moral bankruptcy. Michael was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit tax evasion. When the sentence was read, his knees buckled just like they had at the altar. He had to be physically held up by his public defender. Eleanor got it worse, because she was the primary architect behind draining the Vanderwall Family Foundation. The judge threw the absolute maximum sentence at her: 12 years in a maximum security federal women's penitentiary. No country club prison, no early parole for good behavior. When the bailiff came to handcuff her, she didn't look at the judge. She turned around and looked right at me. Her face was gaunt. Her roots had grown out, showing stark, dull gray hair. The Botox had worn off, leaving behind deep, bitter lines of permanent rage. I didn't sneer. I didn't gloat. I just looked her dead in the eye, raised my hand, and gave her a slow, polite little wave. She screamed obscenities until the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom slammed shut behind her. With Michael and Eleanor securely locked in concrete boxes, there was only one open loop left to close: the Vanderwall Family Foundation. The money they had stolen was supposed to go to pediatric cancer research. It was supposed to save children's lives, and instead, it had been used to pay for country club dues and imported orchids. The federal government had managed to recover some of the funds from the frozen Cayman accounts, but millions were still missing, burned through by Eleanor's extravagant lifestyle. So, I waited until the auction house in Geneva finished selling off Eleanor's art collection and the antique furniture from the penthouse. The auction brought in just over $4.5 million. I didn't keep a single penny of it. I took the entire sum, matched it dollar for dollar from my own personal tech fortune, and wired a $9 million anonymous donation directly to the pediatric oncology ward that the foundation was originally meant to support. The only stipulation I put on the donation was that the new research wing be named in honor of my late foster mother, the woman who had taught me how to read, how to code, and how to stand up for myself when the world told me I was nothing. It was the ultimate cleansing of the Vanderwall toxicity. Their dirty money had been completely transformed into something pure, something that would heal people instead of hurting them. A year has passed since that day at St. Patrick's Cathedral. I don't drive the dented 10-year-old Honda Civic anymore. Not because I'm ashamed of it, but because I finally realized that hiding my success to make other people comfortable was just another way of playing the victim. I bought myself a sleek, midnight blue Porsche 911. I moved out of the rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn and bought a stunning sun-drenched loft in Tribeca with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline that Eleanor used to think she owned. I still buy clothes at thrift stores sometimes because vintage denim is just objectively better, but I pair them with diamond tennis bracelets and Prada boots because I earned every single dollar I have. And I refuse to apologize for it ever again. My cybersecurity firm is thriving. We just secured a massive government contract, and my net worth has nearly doubled. But more importantly, my circle is impenetrable. I surround myself with people who knew me when I had nothing, people who love me for my fiercely loyal, slightly ruthless heart, not my bank account. Every once in a while, I'll get a letter forwarded from the federal penitentiary. It's usually from Michael, scribbled on cheap, lined paper. The first few letters were full of rage, blaming me for ruining his life. The more recent ones are pathetic, begging me for forgiveness, asking if I can put money on his commissary books because he can't afford decent soap. I don't read them anymore. I just drop them directly into the paper shredder in my home office and listen to the satisfying hum of the blades turning his words into confetti. People often ask me if I regret letting it go as far as it did. They ask if it would have been easier to just quietly break up with him that rainy Tuesday afternoon when I heard them plotting my demise in the hallway. Easier? Yes, but easy doesn't teach a lesson. Easy doesn't stop predators from finding another vulnerable target. Eleanor and Michael thought they had found a lamb they could lead to the slaughter. They thought poverty equaled stupidity and that desperation equaled compliance. They wanted to strip me of my future, my freedom, and my dignity, just to keep the lights on in a Hamptons mansion they didn't even deserve. I didn't just teach them a lesson. I became the consequence they never saw coming. I let them build their own gallows, buy their own rope, and tie their own noose. All I did was kick the stool out from under them, and looking out over the glittering lights of Manhattan from my penthouse, knowing that I am safe, successful, and entirely unbreakable, I can honestly say I have never slept better in my entire life. Do I? You see, the reason I sleep so soundly isn't just because I won. It's because I finally understood the fundamental rule of the world we live in. Predators do not respond to boundaries, they do not respond to kindness, and they certainly do not respond to you shrinking yourself to make them comfortable. They only respond to consequences. Right now, you might not be fighting off Manhattan billionaires in federal court. You might not be dealing with offshore Cayman accounts or high-end art auctions in Geneva, but I know exactly who you are dealing with. You are dealing with your own versions of Eleanor and Michael. We all have them. Maybe it's a narcissistic boss who takes credit for your late nights and stolen weekends, subtly reminding you that you're replaceable. Maybe it's a manipulative partner who drains your energy, gaslights your reality, and convinces you that you're the one who is crazy. Maybe it's a friend circle that secretly roots for your failure, offering backhanded compliments every time you dare to step out of the box they put you in. They look at you and see exactly what the Vanderwaals saw in me, a lamb, a target, someone whose desperation, kindness, or lack of resources makes them the perfect battery to power their own toxic ecosystem. Society tells us to take the high road. We are told to forgive, to forget, to walk away quietly and let karma handle the rest. But let me tell you something about the high road. It is a lonely, unpaved dirt path that usually just leads to another predator. Karma isn't a magical force that corrects the universe while you sit back and wait. Karma is what happens when you decide to become the architect of your own justice. Karma requires a blueprint, an iron will, and the absolute refusal to ever let someone mistake your patience for weakness again. The reason I am sitting here, sharing every single detail of how I dismantled an empire and rebuilt my own from the ground up, isn't to gloat about the Porsche or the sun-drenched Tribeca loft. It's to hand you the exact same playbook I used. It's to show you that the gap between being a victim and being a victor isn't about how much money you start with. It's about strategy. It's about how carefully you can watch the board, how quietly you can gather your evidence, and how ruthlessly you can execute your plan when the clock strikes 9. You don't need a custom Vera Wang gown to walk into a room and command respect. You need leverage. You need an unshakable understanding of your own worth, and you need the tactical skills to protect it. That is exactly what we do here. This space isn't for the people who want to complain about how unfair the world is. It's not for the people who want to huddle together and share stories about their toxic exes or terrible bosses without ever actually doing anything to change their circumstances. This space is a masterclass in leverage. Every single week, I am breaking down the psychology of power. I am giving you the exact strategies to read the room, to identify the manipulators before they ever get their hooks into you, and to build an impenetrable fortress around your mind, your money, and your future. We talk about how to negotiate when you have zero leverage, how to turn a disadvantage into an offensive weapon, and how to quietly build your own empire while your enemies think you are still sleeping. Think of this as your own personal cybersecurity firm, but for your life. I want to teach you how to encrypt your emotions so narcissists can't hack them. I want to show you how to audit your inner circle and ruthlessly fire anyone who doesn't belong on your personal executive board. I will show you how to recognize the microaggressions, the subtle financial manipulations, and the psychological traps that the elite use to keep you small, and how you can reverse engineer those exact tactics to build your own unassailable wealth. We will dissect the art of the silent move. You will learn why the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one yelling or throwing their weight around, but the one sitting quietly in the corner, tracking the data, knowing exactly when to pick up the phone and make the call. This channel is your mirrored hard drive. It is the holy grail of life strategy, career advancement, and personal sovereignty. When you join this community, you are not just watching a video, you are stepping into Vance's corner office. You are taking a seat at a table where power is dissected, understood, and ultimately acquired. Every time you tune in, you are upgrading your mental armor. You are giving yourself the 20% raise that the world refused to give you. I will walk you through the exact legal, financial, and psychological frameworks needed to outmaneuver the people who think they own you. And most importantly, I want to show you how to unapologetically step into your power, put on the Prada boots, and never say, "I'm sorry" for your success ever again. If you are tired of playing the lamb, if you are done lowering your voice to keep the peace, and if you are ready to become the consequence they never saw coming, then you are exactly where you belong. But you cannot do it alone, and you cannot do it by leaving your growth to chance. Consider this your first strategic move. Do not just watch this and walk away, leaving yourself vulnerable to the next predator that crosses your path. Lock in your place in this inner circle right now. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notifications. Make the active decision today to arm yourself with the knowledge, the strategy, and the unapologetic ruthlessness it takes to build a life that no one can ever take away from you. The gallows are already built. The manipulators in your life have already bought the rope. Now it's time to learn exactly how to kick the stool out from under them. Hit subscribe, join the firm, and let's get to work.